Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very special Lunch and Learn. My name is Marc-Andre Pigeon, or Marc-Andre Pigeon, and I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we're coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, and as such, that means that I and all of us here live in relationship with the nations that were and are parties to this treaty and similar agreements. And in this region, that includes the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the Métis. We're grateful for this opportunity to work and live on this land and acknowledge that as we meet, share, and learn from each other today, as partners, allies, and friends, we are all treaty people, and we reaffirm our commitment to this hard, shared, and necessary work of reconciliation. Next, you're going to notice that our setup is a little different from our usual approach to these kinds of events. This is because we have the good fortune of being able to enlist the services as a very talented AV crew who are helping to shoot a lot of different pieces for the Johnson Soyama Graduate School of Public Policy. So we were able to schedule them on a pretty short notice for this talk and really give it a kind of professional flair. And so that's what you're going to see today. I'd like to thank the folks at JSGS for giving us this opportunity, unexpected opportunity and very welcome opportunity. Because of this special setup, we're going to have some additional parameters how this talk works. Here are things going to unfold. Patricia, our guest speaker from the Cooperative Housing Federation, is going to talk to us for about 25-30 minutes. Then we're going to have about 15 minutes of question and answer, and then we're going to conclude. We hope to finish around 12:50 today so that the AV crew can kind of move on to their next shoot. At the Q&A part of this event, we're going to ask that folks use the Zoom chat function. We're going to be monitoring that, and I'm going to be kind of bringing your questions to Patricia at the podium here. For in-person attendees, if you can write your questions on a piece of paper, Stan will take those to me, and I'll be able to ask Patricia your questions. For the duration of the Zoom call, we're going to ask that folks keep their microphones muted. And then, as the talk is being recorded, or after the talk is being recorded, we're going to have this professionally edited and posted to our website. So, with that out of the way, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Patricia Tessier, and she's visiting us today from Ottawa, where she is the Director of Member Services at the Co-operative Housing Federation of Canada. So before joining CHF Canada, Patricia worked as Vice President of Organizational Effectiveness at the Ottawa Community Housing Corporation, where she was a key member of the executive team overseeing that organization's $2.7 billion housing portfolio of 15,000 homes. Patricia's talk today is titled Housing Cooperatives for a Housing Market in Crisis. I think you're in for a treat. Patricia, thank you so much for joining us today and for agreeing to do this. We're really looking forward to what you have to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. As mentioned, my name is Patricia Tessier. I work with our members who govern the organization, the co-op that I work for, Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. I'm the Member Services Director. So today I am going to talk to you about the housing market in Canada and as it relates to co-op housing sector and the role that co-op housing sector plays in the housing market, and how housing co-ops and public policy could help alleviate the housing crisis and its impact and really improve the lives of Canadians. I also want to acknowledge, as part of my journey towards reconciliation and my visit here to Saskatoon, the territory and homeland of the Métis that is covered by the Treaty 6 territory. Not sure if you can see the medal, the Treaty number 6 medal. I researched this as part of my journey towards reconciliation. When I do travel, I like to research and understand the lands I'm on, the history, and I was really taken. I really appreciate this medal, as I did when I learned about the two-row wombat belt, because it symbolizes mutual respect, balance, and reciprocity. The Treaty 6 medal is representative of the relationship the Crown had with First Nations, the Cree, Nakota, and Saulteaux leaders who signed the Treaty 6 in 1876 in Fort Carleton, where determined to ensure the peoples would continue as distinct, flourishing nations. I'm a strong believer that reconciliation and building relationship go hand in hand, and I think this medal symbolizes that. So as I begin, or before I begin, I will, as mentioned, speak to the housing sector in general in Canada, and then go into the co-op housing sector. So what's happening in the housing sector in Canada? I don't think it will be a surprise to many of you that we are faced with unprecedented increases in home prices in Canada. As reported by Better Dwelling in 2021, home prices saw inflated adjusted increases of 21.4%. Since 2005, Canada has seen home prices rise 139%. In contrast to the US, who's seen housing prices of 10%. Some study of G7 countries show the increases in housing prices since 1975, and unbelievably, you see Canada is now actually at the top in 2021 and one of the highest in terms of increases. I can only speculate, as I haven't researched this topic myself to prove it out, but that possibly the lack of public policy or ineffective policy to control and mitigate artificially inflated real estate value has contributed to this crisis. But let's hold that thought. So I guess I can't look at housing prices in isolation. One could say if incomes were rising at the same pace, perhaps it's not a problem. So let's look at income. Unfortunately, income levels are not rising at the same rate as the housing prices. Housing prices increases annually of 24% was noted in 2021. Disposable income, however, increased only by 1.7%. Again, looking at since 2005, disposable income has increased only 46% against the housing price increase of 149%. You map this out, continued growth over the next 5 years, it is very clear the big gap between income and housing prices. So no matter how you look at it, this is a growing gap and a problem. What is the impact? The impact is increased pressure on the rental market. When homes are not attainable for those wishing to buy, there's greater pressure on the housing market and greater pressure for profit of private ownership, as well as many other factors we're going to look into as well. To add on to this, and the last component to look at is population and population growth. According to the Fraser Island Institute, in the 1970s, a new home was built for every 1.2 additional Canadian. In 2010, a new home was built for every 2.1 new Canadians. Bottom line, Canada isn't building enough homes. So, how did we get here? What are some of the other impacts of not having enough homes? So, in the 1945 to 1980s era, the post-welfare state, this is where we saw most co-op housing development. And interestingly now, we're getting to the end of some of these programs and mortgages and so on, that is creating more challenges. For example, in Ontario, at the end of mortgage, the funding program was built into legislation and there was a funding formula error. Some co-ops have come out of their mortgage and are now in a negative subsidy. So the financial realities and the ability to sustain these housing co-ops really depend on positive, helpful public policy that's adjusted to the reality of co-ops. Continued subsidy because of income disparities and the fact that incomes are not rising at the same rate as housing costs also require government public policy. In the mid-1980s to 2000s, what we might call retrenchment and devolution, we saw a lot of cutbacks to these programs, deregulation. And now, through 2008 to today, we've seen changes to amortization rates, programs that aren't always helpful. If they add longer terms to make it viable to get financing, that doesn't allow for the capital reserve replacements when you have a mortgage amortization of 50 years and you have life cycle replacement of housing components of 25 or 30 years. So the programs are not, the public policy that's been put forth and the programs that have been put forth are not always recognizing the realities on the ground. So to get a bit more into co-op housing, community housing aspects, very insightful report that was developed in the United States by a group called Right to the City Alliance. We don't have I did not find, I should say, a similar report here in Canada. But in the graph, I depict through the 5 areas that they looked at: community control, affordability, inclusivity, permanency, quality, and health. I've identified where the Right to the City Alliance states that the current housing model in the US fails on those aspects, and I will highlight some of those points. Where in Canada, I think we would say, similarly, most of those models also fail on these fronts. But however, the co-op difference in all of these areas does not fail and can even exceed with the correct public policy to further strengthen those components. So a few insights from the report from the Right to the City Alliance. On community control, for example, land and housing, there's 96.3% of housing stock in the land it's on is commodified. I'm pausing there. 96.3% of the housing stock is commodified. Private equity and ownership is high, evidently, and co-ops, land trusts, public ownership is low. Democratic control, pretty much non-existent. That was their conclusion. The Right to the City Alliance studied it and saw democratic control is pretty much nil. That is not the case for housing co-ops. That is a principle embedded in co-ops, general, including co-op housing. Some renters in the US do not have just cause eviction. There is where there is some difference in Canada, but even more difference in housing co-ops who offer security of tenure through membership and through the principles that they abide by. Affordability. Nearly half of all tenants, of all renters in the US have unaffordable rents. 1 in 4 renters pay more than half their income to housing. The last Statistics Canada report I found in 2019 showed then that we were nearing the 50%. Given now where we're at in inflation, I would say that statistic is probably very similar or close in Canada. Inclusivity. Transgendered and others face discrimination when trying to get housing. There's low credit scores, eviction records that can be impediments for some to get housing. Permanency. Several million evictions occur each year nationally in the US at the rate of more than 7,400 a day. Again, I don't have the statistics for Canada, but I can tell you for housing co-ops, that is not the rate of evictions. Quality and health have a very, very interesting points made in this report. And I think we've heard many times that housing can be a determinant of health. Another really good point for public policy to consider. The Right to City Alliance pointed out that suicides attributed to evictions doubled between 2005 and 2010. Forced displacement increases the likelihood of depression among mothers. Housing instability disrupts treatment of chronic health conditions and reduces families' ability to afford health care. In Canada, luckily, we have public health care. These are sobering and shocking impacts. And we'll speak a little bit more about how co-op housing can address all of these. So, as I mentioned, the Right to the City Alliance adeptly demonstrated the impact of housing on, the impact housing has beyond housing into areas of health, mental and physical health, homelessness, the job market, labor, ability to secure a job, as well as the ability to retain a job. The diminishing and possibly disappearance of disposable income obviously has a huge impact on the economy. I'm going to repeat that. The diminishing and possible disappearance of disposable income impacts the economy. This is something that as policymakers in the government should be paying close attention to. Paying more on housing, not having disposable income, will impact the economy. Aging in place, aging population with fixed incomes is also a grave challenge, and we're seeing that more and more in the housing co-ops. And how can they be leveraged to help with this crisis? They being housing co-ops. The housing co-op model, a proven model. Affordable forever. Stronger communities. Democratic and principled. Security of tenure. Right, resonating with some of the points made in the U.S. group of the Right to the City Alliance. These are needed. So part of the solution, in my opinion, is definitely, solution to the housing crisis, is definitely the time-tested co-op housing model. The model and the cooperative principles embedded in this model, as you know, are the success factors, not only to affordability and perpetuity, but also to the stronger communities they build, developing skill sets that strengthen the labor market and offer security of tenure and stability. As we just heard, lack of stability impedes people's ability to deal with chronic health concerns. CHF Canada commissioned a study of the co-op difference to confirm the value of investing in co-op housing. This research study, entitled The Co-op Difference, compared non-profit co-op housing charges or housing charges against similar private sector market rent across 5 Canadian cities over a period of 15 years. Co-ops were consistently more affordable than market, and the gap widened over time. Co-op housing charges for 1 and 2 bedroom apartments were approximately 25% less than private market, $150 to $250 a month in the early years. Later, the gap was bigger, and they were more affordable at approximately 33% more affordable than market, so approximately $400 to $500. That is proven. We looked at that, and that is a study that demonstrates the affordability of co-op housing, meaning investments in co-op housing go a lot further. While there's ample examples that I could give about stronger communities in housing co-ops, I just came from Terra Co-op and Saskatoon. Great case study. Really good example of building stronger communities, supporting each other. These can go on, and if they are needed for public policy decisions, we will provide them. Sarcee Meadows is an example, created a women's circle that was to bring together people from different cultures. They now also help in the community nearby, not only the housing community, but externally, and help with the Calgary Helping Homeless to serve meals. There's many food gardens that are developed through initiatives to address food insecurity in co-ops. There were food cupboards in many of the co-ops, and we heard this particularly through the pandemic. Some co-ops have also designated their units to help people, women fleeing domestic violence, or others have dedicated them for people with physical disabilities. Again, these are just a few examples towards inclusion at housing co-ops. Housing co-ops are also governed by volunteers, and these volunteers dedicate hundreds and thousands of hours to govern the co-ops they live in. That would have very interesting, or that could be also a very interesting analysis to see the economic benefit of these volunteer hours within housing co-ops. So, what's the problem or opportunity? Here, 2/3 of the market in Canada is home ownership, 1/3 approximately these rental. Housing co-ops are but a tiny, near 1% of the market. Bottom line, Canada needs more co-op housing solutions. So, we're the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. We are trying to lead the vision of co-op housing for all to grow from 1 to 2% of the market through new models as well, new models such as community land trusts, collectives, so bringing cooperatives together through a bigger umbrella in essence. We see some programs, again, not quite policy yet, but some programs that are starting to enable this, such as in Nova Scotia, just developed a new cooperative land model. These will help to ensure perpetuity of affordable housing, such as housing co-ops. We also started developing partnerships across the sector, so not only in housing co-ops, but across. Like Community Affordable Housing Solutions is an example, and that's in Toronto, and the municipality there, again, has been involved. To grow the sector as well as maintain it, we have crunched many numbers, and I'm happy to show these to anyone interested. We need public's involvement to a degree, in some level, to ensure affordability. Public awareness and co-op education. Here is an area I do believe should be more embedded in public policy in our school systems. I have children, 6 in fact. They are not learning about co-ops at their elementary school or high schools. I have a few I know at university and business courses where professors are shrugging off co-ops as old-fashioned. We need more focus on awareness and education of the cooperative model. I mention it where I go. I mention cooperatives. Young people think I'm talking about their high school co-op placements. So this is an area that is very much worth investing in and can be part of a curriculum. We do have a co-op housing development program that was identified in the federal 2022 budget. It's a program co-developed with the sector, so I commend the government for this step. It does recognize how housing co-ops, cooperatives, are different and distinct, and why the existing programs weren't quite the right fit for them, for co-ops. So it allows us to take this into consideration. Co-ops are governed and they operate under their 7 principles. Those need to be funded. Those need to be in their budget. Education and the governance structure. Again, coming back to the report from the Right to City Alliance, the lack of democratic control is problematic. It's not in a housing co-op. That small bit of extra funding that's needed to recognize and have this model, that is a proven model, is a worthwhile investment. So we do have the Co-op Housing Development Program coming out, and that recognizes the distinct nature of co-ops and the value that they offer. So, a little bit more on exploring public policy and what can be done. Just a few ideas, because there are many more. Speculation on tax on land profits could definitely be helpful. We're looking at development now for housing co-ops. Having free land would make it possible to develop affordable housing. And this isn't even 100% affordable, but to a 30% affordable. Public land allocation, therefore, for co-op housing development could be an area to look at amongst public policy. I will recognize and know that there is a federal lands initiative. I visit that website to see what's available for land offered up for development, and there's not much. It doesn't come up a lot. So recognize it's there. Others can do it, and it's needed. A vacancy tax, I think that is being looked at hopefully seriously. A vacancy tax where funds can be used for development for seed capital. Seed capital is a barrier to new development. Public policy on, as I mentioned, cooperative education as part of the school curriculum. Definitely enduring income subsidies. We see this a lot that, for example, we offer asset and financial planning services to housing co-ops that are members of CH of Canada. In the refinancing, when it's a temporary program for rental subsidy, lenders don't know what to do with that. Right? They, in their minds, that funding ends when the agreement with the government ends, and therefore it puts them more at risk. So enduring rental subsidies are required. As we saw, the increase in incomes is nowhere near the increase in housing prices. Something needs to be done to ensure that income supplements are available for the most vulnerable, to enable them to access housing. Public finance, loan guarantees. I put that out there as a possibility. We certainly have and see housing co-ops finance without those, not all of them. It really depends on the programs that they were under, to be honest. But it can assist in cases where private sector lenders deem them to be too risky or require a guarantee. And then the last one I had here, and I look forward to ideas and questions afterwards, is a public procurement criteria for social enterprises and cooperative businesses. I've certainly in past life had a lot of experience with public sector procurement. There is a lot of potential to embed in public policy procurement criteria or percentage allocation to cooperative businesses. And I'll repeat, to cooperative businesses. They are businesses, particularly housing co-ops are sometimes viewed as not businesses, as social housing. They are businesses, and allocating and designating under many programs that are put out by the government, having designation allocations for co-op businesses would be highly beneficial. Again, not just to co-ops, but to all of Canadians. For those less familiar with co-ops, it's a member-based, member-owned and governed, and members benefit. Therefore, any profit, if there's profit, or any outcome of that business benefits all of the members in the co-op. So I think I am done now, and maybe even ahead of time. I'm going to end with my last slide, which I appreciate and acknowledge Generation Squeeze for. I love this visual. I love visuals, really, to put these problems or opportunities into perspective. This visual demonstrates the public spend in social programs, the elephants, the rhinoceroses, health and education, and then I think that's a Harrison or a hedgehog, tiny, bit of spend in housing. Given the interdependency between housing and these factors of health, education, economy, and the labor market, I think that Harrison needs to become at least a rhinoceros. The $1 invested really goes so much further. $1 in housing co-ops goes even further. But the strong communities, the affordability and perpetuity, as we demonstrated, that they're more affordable the later in life, 25% more affordable to 33% more affordable. So in my equation, the spend on housing, co-op housing in particular, is much more effective and better leveraged by government. So the problem, yet our opportunity exists for housing co-ops to address the current failing housing models, and the crisis, including health, homelessness, aging in place, and poverty, in a sustainable way for generations to come. Public policy could help make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That was wonderful. I have to acknowledge that I asked Patricia to give it a distinctly public policy inflection, so I appreciate you taking that extra effort. I'm really grateful for that. Now we're at the question and answer period. And as I said earlier, if you're on Zoom, maybe you can submit your questions, or maybe please submit your questions through chat. I will be monitoring these questions and asking them to Patricia. I have one question from our audience members here. I'm going to ask it, and then that'll get us going. So Patricia, here we go. Are existing housing cooperatives applying to the National Housing Strategy to expand and provide more co-op housing? Part A. And part B, is CHF helping create new co-ops to leverage available funds? So that's part B.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, some are definitely tapping into the funding available through the National Housing Strategy. There are a couple in particular. The National Housing Strategy provided money for what they called at that time the Technical Resource Center, now called the Community Housing Transformation Center. And they had a community or community tenant initiative funding that co-ops have tapped into, as well as some sector transformational funding, which CHF Canada has also tapped into. So yes, can speak lots more about that over the pizza lunch, but if that's good for now. There's also some co-investment funding and seed funding, funding for building condition assessments, aging study, that some co-ops have tapped into as well. The difficulty or difference there, and why I highlighted the co-op housing development program, is just the way that those programs are structured. So the contributions are not very high, so it makes it hard to build new, particularly affordable. And the criteria needed to meet to even get the highest contribution is on a project-by-project basis. So the energy efficiency and accessibility requirements sometimes, make it more difficult, make it more costly. And then, of course, one of the really good points to highlight, so thanks for the question, is that in Canada, the housing co-ops, on average, there's 35 units per housing co-op on average in Canada. Other countries like Austria and Spain, in Austria it goes up to 3,387, in Spain 1,002, I believe are the numbers. So it helps to have more units in the co-op, but those that are to tap into these funding. The capacity is definitely an issue. Seed funding is definitely an issue. You have to have, 300,000 to 400,000 to begin exploring development. So, yeah.
Thank you, Patricia. So I'm going to just put out another call for people to send their questions via chat. While we're waiting for some questions, I have a couple. I've given Patricia a heads up on one of them anyway, and a few more that follow. Patricia, so you have this kind of really interesting background where you've worked in the public housing space and now the co-op housing space. And can you kind of set out what you see as the distinctive features of the cooperative housing space relative to the public housing? They're both addressing the kind of same objective, at least the housing, providing home for people. But what's the distinctiveness that you kind of get out of that co-op housing space that you don't get in the public housing space? And what's the story you tell to policymakers to kind of tilt the balance towards the co-op housing versus public housing? And I'll just one last little thought, because I think from a policymaking perspective, it's probably easier to say I'll fund public housing than co-op housing. So how do you kind of get that story across?
Well, I'm not sure we've totally gotten that story across yet. So definitely looking, to universities and research partners to help with that, because I think, that's the data to prove it out is seemingly what we hear. And education and awareness, I think there's really not that full understanding of the distinction yet. So giving probably the size of the sector. So as we grow, I think that will become more easier and easier. But I'll touch on some things, some of the distinctions between the public housing corporations and so on versus cooperatives, housing cooperatives. So I would say the scale of public housing is a big factor and a differentiator. As you noted, it makes it probably easier, yes, for, in Ontario and municipalities that are also constrained with capacity, to go to one big one and get a big impact, than to go to 30 smaller and potentially seemingly more work. This is also why we're looking at other solutions where there are umbrella trusts or whatnot, umbrella or larger, cooperatives with many, like up cooperative with neighborhoods of cooperatives, so unification or collectives, so we can increase the capacity and the resources available amongst co-ops to then be able to work more effectively with the public sector. Definitely give kudos to those, working in the public housing. It's no surprise, I think many we've seen that mixed housing communities, so mixed income, helps. So many of the public housing is 100% subsidized. That does become a more difficult factor for sure. Whereas in housing co-ops where there is a mix, I think that is an element and a distinction. The biggest one, in my view, though, is really the cooperative principles. Where a co-op is truly living those principles and embedding them in everything that they do, that's empowering. That is leveraging resources. So again, just from an example today, had really what I'd say is a co-op living truly the cooperative principles. They cited member participation of 93%, people supporting units and persons in units with accessible units, shoveling, learning skills, maintenance, financing, asset management. They don't need to do that in the public housing. They have tenant groups and engage them. It's not the same sense of ownership and not the same component of education and skills development. So those are just a few.
Thank you so much, Patricia. We do have a question from the audience, and here it is. It's from Isabel. How important do you think it is the right to housing, as now recognized in Canada, and the role of housing advocacy in changing the environment for co-op housing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, certainly the right to housing is important for housing in general, vulnerable and low-income populations in particular. I guess I'd like to think that housing co-ops already were very good at ensuring that, given the security of tenure for members there. So how impactful on the housing co-op model and sector, I'm not sure yet. I think it's, waiting to see. But in general, in Canada, I think, yes, there'll be benefits. And the benefits for the housing sector in general will probably ripple to the housing co-op sector as well. So, good.
Wonderful, Patricia. Thank you so much. This is a bit of an unusual dance where I step in and step out. So we have another question here from the audience, the in-person audience. What kind of supports would be the most needed for housing co-ops who are just starting out?
So just starting out, I'm taking that as somewhat just starting a co-op. So just starting a new housing co-op. Education, definitely. Setting up the governance structure and membership engagement, membership communication. We saw, interestingly, through the pandemic that the lack of communication between board and members, for example, created a lot of tensions and conflicts that didn't really need to be there. So, over communicate, educate, build that sense of community from the start. We hear also a lot of members that come to co-ops more because it's affordable. And they might actually not know anything about co-ops. So get that education, those principles embedded and understood at the very beginning for any new member coming to the co-op.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question from the audience here, and this reflects some of the data you've shared with us, Patricia. Given home ownership makes up most of Canada's housing market, it seems like people want to own their homes eventually. Do you think provincial legislation supporting home ownership, co-ops, and co-housing would help address affordability concerns?
Yes, possibly. I find it interesting, having traveled, that, we think we're privileged in Canada that we have a lot of land, but in fact, I think that's not always helped us. It's a culture here to have home ownership because it's a possibility, through land, probably more than anything. In Austria, for example, home ownership is not the norm, and it doesn't have to be. We've somehow in Canada associated that with esteem, or I'm not quite sure, but it's the culture. So it's public policy, it's public perception, public education, and a shift. I'm hoping a shift that will give greater pursuit of housing co-ops as a model and an acceptable one. Of course, we can get into long-term pensions and sustainability. So that's another public policy angle, right? To ensure that you don't have to have a home and rely on that value to be able to retire. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Patricia. We put out a last call for questions online. I have one that I'm going to throw your way, kind of a more macro question. We are in this inflation environment where costs are going up, and I imagine this is eroding or challenging the ability to people kind of start co-ops. Have you seen any evidence of that, or even thinking about the federal government's allocation of funds to support the co-op housing sector? From a year ago, you probably can buy less than you could buy then. So how is that shaping your thinking? Have you kind of given that any thought about your work?
Yeah, it's twofold. It's starting new, as well as existing. Really, again, another member co-op I was speaking to last night. The cost, maintenance costs, labor costs. Their budget currently is fairly huge deficit. We don't want co-ops to be thinking they can't run their co-op or have to sell. So it's a big problem for both aspects, for sure. Advocacy on this and the new creative models that we're looking at to bring resources together to help in this situation are an option. For building new, the Co-op Housing Development Program is an example of why we advocated for that, and hoping that the design of that program enables more affordability, because the contribution, in essence, has to be bigger. The equity component, not lending. It can't be 100% lending. It just won't work. You can't build affordability. So it means that there's less available, less affordable units of any new build. That is a problem. So advocacy, education, creative solutions, and partnerships.
Wonderful. And this will be our last question for the event. Thank you again, Patricia. So here's the question. Could you please speak to the opportunity that exists for those in other professions, such as social work, to collaborate in the advocacy for co-op housing when the need may be seen on frontline by those workers?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure they do. We have campaigns, so having their participation, Vote Housing campaign, so participating in that and lending your voice there, for sure. Contact us. Social enterprises, partnerships with housing and new development. So I'd mentioned during the talk a few examples where a certain number of units in a housing co-op were designated for women fleeing domestic violence or for people with disability. I know in the East Coast we're looking also at, I'm working with Autism Nova Scotia. So definitely could work in partnership if they, I know funding is always strained, but sometimes, if they're social service organizations or a charity, that could be a good partnership and allow for different, tax incentives or whatnot that make it more affordable. So yeah, advocate with us and reach out for partnerships.
Wonderful. I love to see those connections getting made. Patricia, thank you again so much for being here today. Thank you all for joining us. Just before you leave, 2 things to flag for you. We have 2 talks coming up. I want to hopefully get this on your radar. Our next co-op conversation is on May 3rd, every Wednesday, first Wednesday of the month. And we're going to feature Marcelo Vieta, Associate Professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. And he's going to be talking to us about his really interesting research on converting kind of privately held businesses into cooperatives that are owned by employees oftentimes. So that's one. Hope you can join us for that. We also have a talk next Wednesday, April 19th, called Scaling Renewable Energy Cooperatives, Lessons from a Successful Multi-Stakeholder Network in the Solar Energy Industry. And that's featuring Stephen Irwin from the United States. Really going to be an interesting talk. And if this interests you, hope you will join us. Watch or check our website for more details. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Take care.